The formation was wrong by 6 degrees, and Sergeant Cade Morrow could hear it. Not with his ears. Ears only told you what was happening now. Cade heard drill the way a man hears weather changing in the bones, in the soles of the feet, in the vibration of the parade deck traveling up through the knees and settling somewhere in the back of the jaw. The Sethkal Combined Arms Lyceum had given him a parade deck made of some composite stone that the procurement officer called thermite-bonded lattice, smooth as glass and harder than anything they poured on Earth, and it transmitted impact with surgical fidelity. Every boot fall that hit that stone arrived in Cade's skeleton like a telegraph signal, and right now the signal said, "The left wing is dragging." He stood at the apex of the formation diamond, arms folded, watching 114 cadets in 16 files attempt the synchronized march and pivot sequence he had introduced 9 days ago. 4 counts forward, pivot left on the 5th, 3 counts at the new heading, halt on the 8th. Earth Basic. A thing you taught green recruits on their 2nd week because it built the habit of thinking as a unit before the curriculum started demanding they think at all. 14 species were attempting it. Most of them did not have bilateral leg symmetry. Some of them did not have legs. The Drethani cadets in the center files were the closest to correct. Tall, blade-thin, with membranous ear frills and a neurological architecture wired for sequence recognition, pattern followers by evolution. They could hear a rhythm once and reproduce it to within a few % variance. The problem was that they reproduced it exactly, every time, with no adjustment for the cadets around them. They marched the pattern. They did not march the formation. The Kethrin were the opposite problem. Big, dense, double-hinged at the jaw and the knee, built for explosive movement, not sustained tempo. When Cade called the count, they surged on 1 and dragged on 4, because their fast-twitch muscle architecture processed the start of a command faster than the sustain. A Kethrin cadet could cross a sparring mat in 1.4 seconds from a standing start. Holding a steady 2-count stride for 8 beats was physically uncomfortable for them, and it showed. The Pelathi were in the rear files, aquatic adjacent, compact, with gill crests along the jaw that fluttered in the dry air and 4-toed feet that gripped the deck instead of striking it. Their footfalls were nearly silent, which meant the formation lost its audible pulse whenever the rear wing carried weight. Cade had told them twice to strike the heel. They kept gripping. The Tessari were the disaster. Insectoid, 6-limbed, with compound eyes and thoracic plates that clicked when they changed direction. They could not pivot on a single foot. Their center of mass sat too far forward, and the pivot threw them off axis every time. 3 of them had collided on the last run-through. 1 had cracked a thoracic plate. And through all of it, on every run, a thing Cade had been tracking since day 1. Nobody looked at anyone else. He let the run finish. The formation halted on the 8th count, ragged, splayed, the left wing a full body width behind the right. The Tessari cadet who had cracked his plate was holding his flank with 2 arms and marching with the other 4, which Cade respected even though the cadence was ruined. "Hold," Cade said. His voice carried across the parade deck without amplification. It was a parade ground voice, not loud by volume but dense by habit, a thing he had built over 11 years of drill instruction on 4 continents and now 1 alien orbital station. He did not shout. Shouting was for instructors who needed the room to know they were angry. Cade was not angry. He was listening. The formation locked. 114 bodies, frozen in the aftermath of a bad run. Cade walked the left wing, slowly, not inspecting that was a different gait, chin up, eyes moving. This was the gait he used when he wanted the cadets to feel the silence and wonder what was being measured. He stopped behind a Kethrin cadet named Torvesk, 3rd file, 4th rank. Torvesk was wide as a door frame, with the mottled green-brown hide and the heavy brow ridge of the Highland Kethrin subspecies. His breathing was audible, a low, grinding rasp that sounded like gravel in a pipe. "Cadet Torvesk." "Sergeant." "On the 5th count, what are you supposed to do?" Pivot left, Sergeant. What did you do? Silence. The grinding rasp slowed. Torvesk's double-hinged jaw tightened in the lateral set that meant a Catherine was choosing between honesty and pride. I pivoted left, Sergeant. You pivoted left at 4.5. You started the turn before the count landed. Why? Another silence, longer this time. The Drethani in the file ahead of Torvesk had their ear frills angled backward, listening. The count felt slow, Sergeant. Cade nodded, not because the answer was right, but because it was honest. He stepped back to the apex and addressed the full formation. I am going to say a thing once, and I am going to need every species on this deck to hear it with whatever organ they hear with, because I will not repeat it. He paused, not for drama. The Tessari needed a beat longer to process interspecies lingua through their compound auditory channels. He had learned that in week 1, the hard way. His first session on this deck had lasted 11 minutes before he stopped it. He had called step off in the standard human cadence, and the result was less a formation than a collision. The Catherine had exploded forward at twice his intended tempo. The Pelathi had not moved at all, because his command register fell below their primary auditory range. The Tessari had begun clicking their thoracic plates in a distress pattern, because the resonance of a human parade ground voice at close range triggered their threat response heuristics. 2 Drethani had marched perfectly, in opposite directions, because their ear frills had processed an echo off the far wall as a second command source. He had stood in the center of the chaos, said nothing for 10 seconds, and then dismissed the formation. That evening he had gone to the Lyceum's xenobiology department and requested a full auditory and kinesthetic profile for every species in his formation. The department head, a Drethani academic named Pelavrin, had looked at him with ear frills angled in polite skepticism and asked what he intended to do with the data. Learn how to talk to them, Cade had said. The profiles had taken 3 days. Cade spent another 4 studying them. He learned that Catherine auditory processing was burst-oriented, fast changes detected well, sustained tones poorly. He learned that Pelathi heard best through vibration transmitted through solid surfaces. He learned that the Tessari processed sound through compound channels that separated a single input into 12 harmonic components, making them sensitive to tonal complexity, but overwhelmed by simple loud noises. He learned that Drethani ear frills could distinguish the direction of a sound source with sub-degree accuracy, explaining the echo problem. By week 2, he had stopped shouting and started engineering. He lowered his vocal register for the Catherine, slowed his cadence for their burst processing. He stomped the deck on the count for the Pelathi, giving them a vibratory cue through their feet. He modulated his command tone to a narrower frequency band for the Tessari. He positioned himself upwind of the Drethani to prevent echo confusion. By week 3, they could hear him. By week 4, they could follow him. By week 5, they could march the same 8-count sequence in something that looked, from a generous distance, like a formation. It was not a formation. It was 14 species following one human voice. But it was a start. By week 6, the transformation from following to matching began the day Cade stopped calling the count and told them to find it themselves. That was when the real resistance started, not from the cadets but from their neurology. Every species had a default tempo, a resting movement frequency dictated by muscle architecture and neural processing speed. The Catherine default was fast. The Drethani default was metronomic. The Pelathi default was nearly static. Asking them to find a shared tempo was asking them to override evolution with a conscious choice, and conscious choices were slow, exhausting, and fragile. Most of the injuries Davrin would later cite came from that period. Cadets fighting their own bodies to match cadets whose bodies worked nothing like theirs. A Catherine who slowed down too fast and strained the tendon that powered his fast-twitch surge. A Tessari who tried to pivot on 4 limbs instead of 6 and cracked a thoracic plate. A Pelathi who struck her heel so hard that the impact stress fractured a tarsal bone. Cade had not flinched. Injuries were data. They told you where the limits were, and limits were what you worked with, not against. He adjusted the drill, added warm-up sequences tailored to each species' stress points, consulted the medical staff, implemented the Tessari thoracic bracing. The injury rate dropped. The matching improved. And now, week 9, the formation had twitched. That was 8 weeks of groundwork talking. Now he stood at the apex and addressed them with the knowledge of every failure that had brought them here. "Your bodies are not the problem," he said. "Your bodies are the instrument. The Kethrin are fast because they were built for fast. The Drethani are precise because they were built for precise. The Pelathi are quiet because they evolved to move in water where sound meant predators. The Tessari change direction with 6 limbs because that is how 6-limbed species change direction. None of these things are defects. Every single one of them is a capability." He let the word sit. Capability was a term the Lyceum used in its assessment rubrics. The cadets understood its weight. "The problem is that you are marching alone. 114 individuals performing the same sequence in the same space at approximately the same time. That is not a formation. That is a coincidence." He walked to the center of the diamond and stopped. Cade was 41, built like a man who had carried packs in terrain that did not forgive poor posture, broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, with hands that looked like they had been designed for gripping things that did not want to be gripped. His face was weathered in the way that outdoor service produced, lines at the eyes, a jaw that sat slightly forward, hair cut to the scalp. He was not the largest person on the deck. He was not the fastest or the strongest. He was the stillest. A formation is a decision. It is 114 individuals choosing on every count to be where the unit needs them to be, not where their instincts put them, not where their anatomy makes it easy, where the unit needs them. That choice, the choice to override what your body wants in favor of what the formation requires, is the only thing that turns a group into a force. He turned slowly, meeting eyes, compound lenses, and lidless amber orbs in sequence. "We are going to run it again. This time I want you to listen, not to me, to the cadet on your left and the cadet on your right. You will hear their footfalls or their tread or their thoracic clicks or whatever sound their body makes when it contacts this deck. You will match it, not the count, not the tempo I call. Them." He walked back to the apex. Formation, ready positions. They set, rag, but faster than the last time. "Step off of my count, 1. They moved. The first 2 beats were rough, the Kethrin surging, the Pelathi gliding, the Drethani snapping into a metronomic cadence that ignored everything around them. But on the 3rd beat something shifted. Cade heard it in the deck. The left-wing Kethrin, Torvesk among them, slowed fractionally. Not because the count demanded it, but because the Drethani beside them were a half-beat behind and the difference was audible. The Kethrin heard the gap and closed it, not perfectly, but intentionally. On the 4th beat the Pelathi struck their heels. The sound was wrong, too sharp, more slap than march, but it was there. The rear wing had a pulse. On the 5th count the formation pivoted, still ugly. A Tessari stumbled. A Kethrin in the right wing went wide, but the core held. The center 4 files, Drethani and Kethrin interspersed, turned as a single body. Cade's jaw did not move. His expression did not change. But something behind his sternum registered the moment the way a tuning fork registers a pitch, a clean, involuntary vibration that meant something had locked. 12 years ago, on a parade ground at Fort Benning, Georgia, his drill instructor, a woman named Chief Warrant Officer Vega, who stood 5'4" and had a voice like a circular saw, had said a thing to him during his worst week. "Morrow, you have the ears. Ears are everything. Any fool can see a straight line. Only a handful can hear when a formation is alive." This formation was not alive yet, but for 3 beats out of 8 it had twitched. "Hold," Cade said. "Better." He said it the same way he said everything, flat, unstressed, a fact delivered without reward. In Cade's experience, praise landed harder when it was indistinguishable from data. He gave them a water break. The Lyceum's hydration protocols were species-specific. The Palathi needed mineral-salted mist sprayed across their gill crests. The Kethrin drank from pressure bladders because their jaws could not seal around standard nozzles. The Tessari absorbed fluid through their ventral plates and needed damp matting. Cade had memorized every protocol in his first week and built a hydration station layout that sequenced the species so no group waited more than 90 seconds, because dead time killed tempo and tempo was everything. While the cadets hydrated, a voice arrived behind him that he had been expecting for 3 days. "Sergeant Morrow." Cade turned. Senior Instructor Davrin stood at the deck's eastern entry. A Kethrin, but not the broad Highland-type Davrin, was a lowland variant, leaner, taller, with sharper features and a hide that was more ochre than green. He wore the double-banded insignia of a senior tactical instructor and carried himself with the controlled rigidity of an officer who had been running combat drills at the Lyceum for 19 years and had opinions about what belonged on a parade deck. "Senior Instructor," Cade said. Davrin walked to the edge of the deck and stood with his arms behind his back. "I observed the last 2 run-throughs from the corridor. The Commandant has asked me to provide an independent assessment of your program's progress for the mid-cycle review. I was informed. I have also submitted a preliminary recommendation to the Commandant's office. I believe you should be aware of it." Davrin's jaw shifted by a fraction, the micro-movement Kethrin used when deciding whether directness was a weapon or a courtesy. "I have recommended that the formation drill component of your program be suspended." The cadets at the hydration stations were too far away to hear, but 2 Drethani near the closest station had their ear frills extended and angled. Cade noted it and did not adjust his volume. "On what basis?" 15 injuries in 9 weeks, including 2 thoracic fractures, a Palathi stress lesion, and a Kethrin tendon strain that required surgical repair. The formation drill is designed for anatomically homogeneous units. You are applying it to a heterogeneous population. The injury rate is a predictable consequence. The injury rate is lower than the Lyceum's standard individual combat training program over the same period, Cade said. "I checked." Davrin's jaw shifted. The comparison is not equivalent. Individual combat training produces injuries in the context of combat-relevant skill acquisition. Formation drill produces injuries in the context of, he paused, ceremony. The word hung in the air, the way Davrin had intended it to. Cade looked at him with the same flat attention he gave a formation that was off-tempo. "Senior Instructor, how many mixed-species units from this Lyceum have held cohesion under tactical stress in the last 10 cycles?" Davrin's lidless amber eyes held Cade's gaze with predatory steadiness. "The cohesion metrics are classified at my clearance level," Davrin said. "They're not. I read the published cycle reviews. The answer is 2. 2 units in 10 cycles held interspecies cohesion during the stress capstone. The other 48 reverted to species-specific movement within the first 90 seconds of contact. That is an oversimplification of a complex tactical problem." "It is." The complex answer is that 48 units failed because nobody taught their bodies to listen to each other before anyone tried to teach their minds to fight together. The formation drill is not ceremony, Senior Instructor. It is the operating system. Davrin held the silence for 4 seconds long for a Kethrin. Then his jaw clicked once. Acknowledgement, not agreement. "The recommendation stands. The Commandant will decide." He turned and walked off the deck. His footfalls were perfectly spaced, perfectly weighted, the walk of a career instructor who had internalized tempo decades ago, and did not notice he was proving Cade's point with every step. Cade watched him go. Then he called the formation back and ran 3 more sequences. The exchange had cost him something, not confidence, but time. He could feel the cadets processing what they had overheard. The Drethani ear frills had carried the conversation across the deck, and by the end of the session at least half the formation knew that someone in the Lyceum's chain of command wanted their drill program shut down. Whether that knowledge would sharpen them or deflate them was a question Cade could not answer until tomorrow. That evening, in his quarters, he played the day's waveforms. The backbone was there in the center 4 files. The Drethani and the Kethrin, who had been interspersed since week 3, had begun to synchronize at a level that went beyond conscious matching. Their peaks were not identical, the Kethrin peaks taller and heavier, the Drethani peaks sharp and clean, but the spacing was converging. The two species were developing a shared tempo built from proximity and repetition, and the simple physics of standing next to someone and hearing them move. He also reviewed the injury report Davrin had cited. 15 injuries accurate, but 12 had occurred in weeks 1 through 5, when the cadets were fighting their own anatomies. In weeks 6 through 9, the rate had dropped to 3, 2 of them tessari thoracic plates brittle by design, fracturing under stresses other species absorbed without issue. The Lyceum's own medical staff had recommended thoracic bracing, and Cade had implemented it. Davrin's recommendation was not about injury rates, it was about jurisdiction. Cade was an exchange officer teaching a discipline that did not exist in the Lyceum's curriculum. If the program succeeded, it meant a human had solved a problem the Lyceum's own staff had failed to solve for a decade. Davrin was protecting the Lyceum's methods the way a man protects the foundation of a house he built. Cade understood that. He did not resent it. He did, however, need the program to survive 5 more days. The exchange program was his idea in one sense and not in another. The coalition had requested a human. Earth Command had selected him. The selection criteria, as far as Cade could reconstruct them, boiled down to 3 facts. He had the highest inter-unit cohesion scores of any drill instructor in the Combined Arms branch. He had no family obligations that would complicate a 2-year off-world posting, and he had, on his last evaluation, received a note from his commanding officer that read, "Sergeant Morrow teaches formations the way other people teach languages, by immersion, not by grammar." He had not known what that meant until he arrived at the Lyceum and realized that the note was the reason he was here instead of one of the 60 other qualified drill instructors in the branch. Someone in the chain of command had understood that teaching drill to 14 alien species was not a grammar problem. It was an immersion problem. You had to live inside the sound before you could teach anyone else to make it. Day 2 of the final push. He split the formation into 4 squads, each deliberately mixed Kethrin with Pelathi, Drethani with Tessari. He gave each squad the 8-count sequence and told them to run it in isolation, matching each other, not him. The first run was catastrophic. Without the anchor of the center files, the squads fragmented. A Kethrin cadet named Relak, one of the strongest marchers in the full formation, could not hold tempo next to a Pelathi because there was nothing to hear. The Pelathi were silent again, reverting to the grip walk under the stress of a new configuration. Cade watched 3 failed runs without intervening. On the 4th, Relak turned his head mid-march and looked at the Pelathi beside him. Not a glance, a sustained look, 2 full counts while his legs kept moving. He was trying to see what he could not hear. On the next count, he adjusted his stride to the visual rhythm of the Pelathi's shoulder movement. Crude, imperfect, the most important thing that had happened on this deck in 9 weeks. Relak had chosen to perceive his teammate through an unfamiliar sensory channel, sight instead of sound, because the familiar one was not available. He had adapted not to the drill but to the person next to him. Cade did not praise him. He filed the moment internally and moved to the next squad, Drethani with Tessari, the combination he had expected to fail hardest. It did fail, but not for the reasons he had predicted. The Drethani, pattern followers to their core, had immediately locked onto the Tessari's thoracic clicking as a rhythm source. The problem was that the clicking was not rhythmic, it was a stress response, a random staccato produced by thoracic plates shifting under the unfamiliar biomechanical load of slow-tempo marching. The Drethani were following a signal that was not a signal. They were marching to the sound of the Tessari being uncomfortable. Cade stopped the squad. He pulled the Drethani lead, a cadet named Several, and explained the problem in terms that a sequence recognition brain could process. The clicking is not a count. It is noise. You are optimizing to fit noise. Several's ear frills flattened, then extended, then flattened again. The Drethani processing cycle, the neurological equivalent of a human blinking rapidly while thinking. Sergeant, my frills do not distinguish between rhythmic and non-rhythmic input at that frequency range. I hear a pattern because my neurology constructs patterns from whatever input is available. I know, that is your strength and right now your problem. I need you to find the actual pattern, the count in the deck, not the noise in the air. Several's ear frills extended toward the deck. For 3 seconds he stood motionless, ear frills angled down at 45 degrees, listening not with the air-sensing membranes but with the vibration-sensing structures at their base, a secondary auditory channel that most Drethani used for predator detection in their species' ancestral forests. The deck carried the cadence pulse into those structures, and Several's body shifted almost imperceptibly as the count registered. I hear it, Sergeant. Good, lead with that. On the next run, Several marched to the deck, and the Tessari beside him, freed from the pressure of being an accidental metronome, stopped clicking. The squad held for 6 beats out of 8, the best any squad had done all morning. Cade ran the remaining 2 squad through 4 more sequences each. By the end of the morning session, every squad had experienced at least 2 runs where the cross-species pairs held tempo for the majority of the sequence. It was not clean, it was not consistent, but the principle was established. When the familiar channel failed, you found another one. You adapted to the person next to you, not to the drill. That was the difference between following and matching, and the squads had started to understand it. He ran 2 more full formation sequences in the afternoon to reintegrate the squads. Day 3. He remerged the formation and added the cadence pulse, a multi-frequency system he had been designing for 3 weeks, using the Lyceum's parade deck speakers to emit a base frequency audible to all 14 species, while transmitting species-specific harmonic overtones tuned to each group's optimal auditory processing range. The Kethran heard a deep, slow pulse that steadied their surge. The Drethani heard a crisp click track for their pattern recognition. The Pelathi felt a subsonic thrum through the deck into their feet, giving them tactile feedback to strike instead of grip. The Tessari heard a rhythmic chirp in the range their compound channels processed fastest. It was not music. It was a translation layer between 14 nervous systems, built to give every species on the deck a version of the same information in the format their neurology could use. The first run with the cadence pulse was the best they had ever produced. The waveform that evening showed peaks converging across all 16 files. The wings were within 2 degrees. The rear held a pulse. The Tessari pivoted without collision. Then the afternoon session went wrong. Cade ran the full formation with the cadence pulse, and the first 2 sequences were solid. The third collapsed. It started with Veshyar. The Pelathi cadet had been one of the steady improvers. She had mastered the heel strike, learned to generate sound where her species produced silence, pushed through the tarsal stress the medical staff had warned might recur. She was in the rear wing 4th file, and on the 3rd count of the 3rd run her right foot slipped. Not a fall, a reversion. The heel strike failed and her toes gripped the deck, pulling her a quarter step behind the cadets on either side. The error rippled. The Drethani to her left, locked into their pattern, marched on. The Pelathi to her right, hearing Veshyar's footfall vanish, lost their own strike and reverted to the grip walk. Within 2 counts, the entire rear wing had gone silent. Cade felt the loss in the deck before he saw it. The formation's pulse died from the back forward, like a wave collapsing. The center held, but the wings disintegrated. By the halt on the 8th count, the formation was back to where it had been 3 weeks ago, a collection of individuals marching in proximity. "Hold," Cade said. The silence that followed was not operative. It was the old silence: confusion, frustration, and the species-specific shame of failing at a thing you had been getting right. He walked the rear wing. Veshar was standing with her gill crests sealed tight, the Palathi posture of distress. Her four-toed feet gripped the deck with the intensity of a species that had spent 9 weeks learning to override an instinct and had just watched the instinct win. "Cadet Veshar." "Sergeant," her voice was thin. Palathi vocal cords were not designed for the station's dry air, and stress made them tighter. "What happened on count 3? "I reverted, Sergeant. The heel strike failed," I gripped. "Why?" The silence was long. Around them, 113 organisms waited to hear what a Palathi would say about the thing most of them had been privately dreading. The moment the training failed and the body won. "Because it hurts, Sergeant." Veshar's voice cracked, not with emotion the way a human voice cracked, but with the literal dryness of vocal cords operating outside their atmospheric parameters. "The heel strike was not designed for my anatomy. Every time I do it correctly, my tarsal arch absorbs an impact it was not evolved to absorb. I have been doing it for 4 weeks and the medical staff has told me the stress markers are elevated. I can do it, but my body does not want to, and on the 3rd count my body decided." Cade looked at her. He did not speak for 4 seconds. This was the moment every interspecies integration program in the Lyceum's history had hit and failed to survive. The moment a cadet said, "This is not possible for my species." He had 2 options: insist and push through, maintaining the standard the Lyceum's own instructors had always set, a single standard, every species forced to meet it, the predictable failure recorded as evidence that interspecies formation drill was unworkable. Or adapt. "Cadet Veshar, stand easy for a moment." She eased, the grip loosened, her gill crests opened slightly. "The heel strike I taught you was designed for human feet. Human feet have a calcaneus bone that absorbs impact through a fat pad and distributes force through an arch built for repetitive loading. Your feet are not built for that. I knew that when I taught you the strike. I taught it because the formation needed to hear you, and striking the heel was the fastest way to make sound with a Palathi foot." He paused. "But it is not the only way." Veshar's gill crests extended the attention position. "Your species communicates through subsonic vibration in aquatic environments. You can generate vibration through your feet without a heel strike through the flat contact of the midfoot, pressed deliberately, with the same muscle group you use for aquatic signaling. I have seen you do it. You do it unconsciously when you are standing still and processing information. You pulse the deck. It is quieter than the heel strike, but the cadence pulse amplifies deck vibration in your frequency range. If you press instead of strike, the system will carry the sound." Veshar looked at the deck. She looked at Cade. Her gill crests fluttered once, not stress, not attention. Something the xenobiology department had told him was closest to the human experience of relief crossed with recognition. "I can press, Sergeant." "Try it." She pressed. Her midfoot contacted the deck in a motion that looked nothing like a march and sounded, through the deck's composite, like a low, rhythmic pulse, softer than the Kethrin's boom, more sustained than the Drethani's snap, but present. Audible, part of the chord. Again. She pressed again. By the 5th press, the Palathi behind her had shifted from the grip walk to the same midfoot press, reading Veshar's movement the way the Kethrin had learned to read the Drethani's tempo. Within 30 seconds, the entire Palathi contingent in the rear wing was pressing, and the rear wing had a pulse again, different from before, lower, more sustained hum than beat, but continuous. They ran it again with the full formation. Not perfect. The Palathi press created a different rhythmic texture in the rear, and the species in front needed 2 full runs to calibrate. But by the end of the afternoon, the formation had recovered, and the waveform showed something new. The Pelathi peaks, previously the lowest and most erratic, had become the most consistent. The press was not a compromise. It was an optimization, a sound the Pelathi could produce without pain, without fighting their anatomy, and without losing their place in the formation. Cade stared at the waveform and thought, Davrin was right about one thing. The heel strike was the wrong tool, but the answer was not to suspend the program. It was to stop assuming that human drill methods could be applied to non-human bodies without adaptation. The drill sergeant's job was not to make 14 species sound the same. It was to make them all sound right. Late that evening, a message arrived from the Commandant's office. One line: Senior Instructor Davrin's recommendation regarding formation drill suspension has been received and will be considered alongside the mid-cycle review results. The review has been rescheduled from day 6 to day 5. Please adjust accordingly. 1 day less. The schedule change was not neutral. Davrin had filed his recommendation knowing that the review would determine whether the program survived, and now the review was a day closer. Whether the acceleration was Davrin's doing or Esrin's own decision, the effect was the same. Cade had lost 24 hours of training time, including 1 full day of the cadence pulse integration that had produced the morning's breakthrough. The Pelathi had found their press only hours ago. Kyrick had not yet resolved the chirp alignment. The Sethurai ghost problem in the right wing remained unaddressed. He had 4 days of work and 3 days to do it. Cade closed the message and sat with the loss for 30 seconds. He did not catastrophize. He did not bargain with the schedule. He looked at the waveform from the morning runs and identified the 3 things that mattered most. The Pelathi press needed 2 more full formation runs to stabilize. Kyrick's speaker needed recalibration, and the Sethurai needed to be repositioned, and began triaging. 2 of the 3 could be done on day 4. The Sethurai reposition would have to happen on the morning of the review itself. That meant the cadets would run the climactic sequence with a formation geometry they had never drilled before, on a day when the Commandant of the Lyceum and the senior instructor who wanted the program terminated would be watching from above. Cade did not flinch from the math. The math was what it was. You worked with what you had. He went back to planning. Day 4. He ran the formation 4 times with the cadence pulse. Each run tightened, but on the 4th a problem surfaced. The Tessari cadet named Kyrick, young, precise, the best Tessari marcher in the formation, started the pivot a quarter beat early, not from error. The chirp overtone in Kyrick's position on the deck was arriving a fraction ahead of the bass pulse because of the angle between 2 speakers. The gap was small enough that no other species noticed, but Tessari compound auditory processing was fast, and Kyrick's neurology keyed on the first signal received. Cade pulled him from the formation. Cadet, you are early on the pivot, consistently. Kyrick angled his head, the Tessari social adaptation for interspecies communication. I am following the signal, Sergeant. You are following the chirp. The chirp is arriving before the bass pulse at your position. You need to wait for the deck vibration. Kyrick's thoracic plates clicked stress. The deck vibration is slower than the chirp, Sergeant. My processing prioritizes the faster input. I know, I am asking you to override that. The clicking intensified. 2 of his 6 limbs shifted in the pattern Tessari, used when fighting competing neurological signals. Sergeant, I am not built to deprioritize faster input. That is not how my species processes. Cade looked at him. Kyrick was 19 standard, thin even for a Tessari, with thoracic plates the color of polished copper and compound eyes that refracted the deck lights into tiny green-gold constellations. The quarter-beat error was not laziness or defiance. It was neurology. Cadet, I hear you. I am going to recalibrate the speaker at your position tonight. But between now and the review, I need you to do something that is not natural and not comfortable. I need you to trust the deck over the air. Can you do that?" Kyrick's clicking stopped. The compound eyes held Cade's face in their fractured gaze. "I will try, Sergeant. That is all I have ever asked anyone on this deck to do." He sent Kyrick back and ran 2 more sequences. On the second, Kyrick's pivot was late by 1/8 of a beat, overcorrecting, fighting the chirp. Ugly, but conscious. A decision. That evening Cade recalibrated the speaker array, adjusting Kyrick's position by a quarter-speaker increment, running the pulse test 3 times until the chirp overtone aligned. He ran the full pulse test once more after the calibration, standing alone on the deck in the artificial twilight, letting the subsonic thrum travel through his boots while the click track tapped in the air and the deep Catherine pulse rolled beneath everything like a slow tide. He needed to feel it as one thing, not 14 frequencies, one rhythm wearing 14 faces. He stood there for 10 minutes, eyes closed, letting the pulse settle into the base of his skull the way a familiar song settles into memory, not learned but recognized. When he opened his eyes, the deck was dark except for the faint glow of the speaker array indicators and the distant blue curve of the planet through the observation wall. He shut the system down and walked to his quarters. There was another problem he had not addressed. The Sethurai cadets, only 4 in the formation, tall and silver-skinned with 3 horizontally slitted eyes, marched with a grace that should have been an asset but was isolating. Their strides were so smooth, so precisely calibrated to their own bodies, that they generated almost no vibration in the deck. They were ghosts. The cadets beside them could not hear them, could not match them, could not use them as reference points. Individually excellent, formationally invisible. Cade sat in the dark of his quarters and looked out at Sethkal Prime turning below. He thought about Vega, about the horse ranch in Montana, about the parade ground at Bennying where he had heard a formation lock for the first time, not his own, someone else's, across the base, and the way the sound had reached him not as individual boot falls but as a single sustained note, like a bell struck once, and the ring lasting longer than it should. He wanted that sound tomorrow. He wanted it from a species that did not wear boots, and a species that did not make sound when it walked, and a species that clicked when it turned, and a species so smooth it was invisible. He wanted it the way a tuner wants a clean note, not as desire, but as recognition of what the instrument was built to produce. He did not sleep well. He never slept well before a review. Morning, day 5. The parade deck gleamed under the station's artificial sun line, a strip of full-spectrum light that ran the length of the Lyceum's central axis, and provided 16 hours of daylight to a habitat that had no horizon. The air was cool, dry, circulated at a rate that accommodated the respiratory needs of 41 species, and satisfied none of them perfectly. Cade had been on the deck since before the cadets arrived, checking the speaker array, walking the formation positions, feeling the deck's vibration through the soles of his boots. He had made one last adjustment that morning. The 4 Sethurai cadets had been moved from the right wing to positions interspersed with the Kethrin in the left wing's front rank. Sethurai and Kethrin were physiological opposites, the Sethurai smooth and silent, the Kethrin heavy and loud. But the Sethurai had 3-eyed horizontal scanning vision that processed movement in a wide arc. If any species could match a partner by sight alone, it was them, and the Kethrin needed a steadying presence. The Sethurai's smoothness might anchor the Kethrin's surge, the way a metronome anchored a drummer. It was a gamble. Cade did not usually gamble on review day, but the right wing had been the weak point for 9 weeks, and he had run out of days. He had also done something he had not told anyone about. At 4:30, 2 hours before the cadets arrived, he had walked the full formation grid in the dark, standing in each species position for 30 seconds, feeling the deck and the cadence pulse from their vantage. He stood where Torvask stood and felt the surge impulse in the deep pulse that the Kethrin would fight. He He stood where Veshar stood and felt the subsonic thrum that she would press into. He stood where Kyrick stood and confirmed the chirp aligned. He stood where Tessal would stand and felt almost nothing. The Sethurai position was the quietest on the deck, and the silence confirmed what he already knew. The Sethurai would march by sight or not at all. By the time he returned to the apex, the artificial sunline was brightening and the first cadets were arriving at the deck's entry. He watched them approach. The Kethrin came in pairs, heavy footfalls rattling the corridor. The Drethani came singly, ear frills already angled toward the deck, listening for the pulse they knew was coming. The Pelathi came in a close group, gill crests fluttering in the dry air, feet already pressing the corridor floor instead of gripping the new habit, holding. Kyrick arrived last, alone, his 6 limbs moving in the staggered configuration he had adopted for walking, different from the synchronized configuration he used for drill. He paused at the deck's edge, compound eyes sweeping the speaker array, and then stepped onto the stone with the deliberate care of someone entering a church. They were ready. Cade knew it the way he knew weather and tempo, and the sound of a formation twitching not from evidence but from the quality of the air. The exchange program that had brought him here was itself a gamble. The coalition had requested a human drill instructor after one of their observers attended a joint exercise on the Meridian Array and watched a platoon of mixed-species recruits from a human-led unit perform a ceremonial drill sequence that the observer later described in his report as a single organism with 64 legs. The report had climbed the chain of command until someone decided the human approach to formation discipline might address a problem the Lyceum had been failing to solve for a decade: interspecies unit cohesion under stress. The problem was real. The Lyceum could train specialists. It could train individual combat proficiency. What it could not reliably produce was a mixed-species unit that functioned as a unit when pressure hit. Species reverted. Kethrin surged ahead. Drethani locked into individual patterns. Pelathi went silent. Tessari clustered with other Tessari. Under pressure, every species defaulted to the movement vocabulary written into its neurology, and the formation disintegrated into 14 simultaneous solo performances. Cade had been given 20 standard weeks to fix it. He was in week 9, half the time gone. A senior instructor who wanted the program suspended. 1 day's training lost to schedule acceleration. And 1 run 8 counts, maybe 40 seconds of real-time movement to prove that a human drill sergeant from Georgia could solve a problem that 14 species and 109 years of institutional expertise had declared unsolvable. The weight of that did not sit on his shoulders the way civilians imagined pressure sat on soldiers. It did not crush. It did not shake him. It settled into his center of gravity like ballast, a thing that lowered his stance and steadied his feet and made him, if anything, more still. Cade Morrow had been carrying weight his entire career. Drill instructors were load-bearing structures. They held the standard so the cadets could push against it, and the standard did not sway because the instructor did not sway. That was the contract. That was the job. Commandant Esrin arrived at the observation platform above the deck at exactly the scheduled time. 7 feet of silver skin and triple-jawed authority. He was accompanied by Senior Instructor Davrin, 2 staff officers, a Drethani academic dean and a Kethrin tactical assessor, and a recording drone. Esrin settled into the observation chair. His 3 eyes tracked the deck with the flat, horizontal scanning motion Sethurai used when cataloging detail. His triple jaw was still. No clicks. Davrin stood to Esrin's right, arms behind his back, jaw in the neutral set. His position next to the Commandant, rather than in the staff row behind, was a statement. He was not a spectator. He was a competing assessment. Cade stood at the apex. The cadets filed in. They assembled in silence, not the anxious silence of the first week. Operative silence, the quiet of a group saving its energy for what came next. Cade had not ordered it. They had chosen it. 114 bodies settled into 16 files. The formation diamond took shape. From the observation platform, it looked like what it always looked like, a geometric arrangement of aliens in institutional gray standing on stone. From where Cade stood, it felt different. The deck was transmitting weight, not movement yet, just the static load of organisms standing still. He could feel the differences: the heavy, low-frequency density of the Kethrin, the light, high-frequency tension of the Drethani, the near-absent pressure of the Pelathi, the distributed six-point contact of the Tessari. And now, in the left wing, the four Sethuri barely there, a whisper of pressure where there should have been a footprint. The formation was a chord, unresolved. All the notes present, waiting for someone to play them. Cade breathed one breath, then he activated the cadence pulse. The parade deck came alive beneath them, not loudly subaudible for most observers. Esren would hear only the faintest hum, but the cadets heard it. Every species heard its own frequency, its own translation of the same underlying tempo. Formation, ready positions. They set clean, faster than any set they had done in training. The diamond locked with a precision Cade felt in his teeth. The Sethuri in the left wing had set without a sound, their bodies arriving at ready position with the eerie smoothness of their species, and beside them the Kethrin had set a fraction slower than usual, steadier. The Sethuri presence was already having an effect before the first count dropped. "Step off on my count." He paused. 1 beat. 2. The deck transmitted the tension of 114 organisms waiting to move and choosing not to. 1. They moved. The first count was clean. The sound of 114 different anatomies striking the deck in near unison produced something new. A composite sound accord made of density and precision and silence and chitin, all landing within a window of time so narrow that the human ear registered it as one event. Count 2, the formation advanced. Cade felt the deck singing vibration crossing the threshold from information to sensation, traveling through his boots, knees, spine, and settling into the base of his skull with a clarity that felt like sound. Count 3. The wings tightened. Relic held his stride with control that looked effortless and was not. Beside him, Veshar was pressing her midfoot with a force that produced the sustained, humming pulse she had found 2 days ago, the sound that her anatomy could make without pain, the sound that the cadence system amplified into something the whole formation could feel. In the left wing, a Sethuri cadet named Tessal was moving with the boneless grace of her species, and the Kethrin beside her, a young male named Grevik who had struggled with tempo control since week 1, was matching her pace. Not hearing her, watching the smooth rise and fall of her shoulder and calibrating his stride to its rhythm. The gamble was working. Count 4, the formation drew breath. The Drethani ear frills flattened in unison, not stress, focus. The Kethrin brow ridges lowered, the Pelathi gill crest sealed. Every species in its own anatomical vocabulary said, ready. Count 5, the pivot. 114 bodies turned left. Cade heard it, the sound he had been waiting for, not the sound of 114 individuals pivoting. The sound of a formation pivoting a single event, produced by 114 separate decisions happening so close together that the gaps between them disappeared. A pressure waved through the deck, up through his skeleton, arriving in his jaw as a single clean tone. The formation was alive. Count 6, 3 beats at the new heading. The formation moved as a body. The wings held. The rear held. Kyrick's pivot had been clean anchored on the deck vibration, the overcorrection from yesterday resolved by the recalibrated speaker, 6 limbs redistributing weight in a configuration that a month ago would have sent him into the cadet beside him. Count 7. The cadence pulse was still running beneath them, but the formation had stopped needing it. Cade could feel the difference. The pulse was a reference, and the cadets had stopped referencing it. They were referencing each other. The Kethrin were holding to the Sethuri's visual tempo. The Drethani were holding to the deck vibration of the Palathi press. The Tessari were holding to the base pulse, yes, but also to the proximity of the Kethrin on either side, whose heavy footfalls created a localized pressure wave that the Tessari's compound channels could process as a spatial reference. Every species had found its anchor, and every anchor was another species. The pulse was a bridge they had crossed and were now standing on the other side of. 16 files of peaks in near-perfect alignment, amplitude differences visible between species, but the spacing converged to within a fraction of a percent. Not human standard drill, not Kethrin or Drethani or any species drill, something that had no precedent in the Lyceum's 109-year archive. Count 8 halt. 114 bodies stopped. The last footfall echoed once and died. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized, the silence of a formation that had arrived at a place it had never been and was standing inside the fact of it. Cade stood at the apex, hands at his sides, jaw set. His eyes moved across the formation, not inspecting, not assessing, witnessing. From the platform, Esren leaned forward. His 3 eyes had stopped their horizontal scan and locked on the deck. The Drethani Dean's ear frills were fully extended, rigid, the way they went when auditory information was too significant to dampen. The Kethrin assessor had set his datapad on the railing and was staring with his jaw slightly open. Davrin was still. His jaw was in the neutral set. He had not moved. Nobody spoke for 4 seconds. Then Esren's triple jaw moved. Click, click, click. 3 clicks, formal attention, the institution processing, but the clicks continued. They accelerated. They climbed in pitch. The trill. It came out of Esren's jaw like something stored there for years, and finally released a sustained, multitonal vibration that carried across the deck, the platform, the corridors beyond, and made every Sethuri within earshot stop. In 109 years, the Commandant's trill during a formation review had been recorded 11 times. The cadets did not know this statistic. They knew the sound. They knew it meant the institution was not just watching but recognizing. Cade held the formation. He could feel every body on the deck, all 114 of them, vibrating with the residual energy of the halt. The deck was still ringing. The composite stone held the formation's last impact like a bell holds a strike, and the ring was clean. He had heard dirty rings, the ones where the overtones clashed and the decay was ragged, the acoustic signature of a formation that had stopped in approximately the same place at approximately the same time. This ring was not dirty. It was a single frequency, decaying at a uniform rate, the kind of ring that only happened when 114 separate impacts landed within a timing window so narrow that the stone could not distinguish them. 11 times in 109 years. Cade did not know that statistic yet, but he knew what the ring meant. He had heard it once before on a field in Georgia 12 years ago, produced by 64 human legs. This was the same ring, different species, different legs, same physics, same choice. Formation stand easy. They relaxed. Not all at once, the Drethani first, the Kethrin last. And in the relaxation, something happened that Cade had never explicitly trained. They looked at each other. Not at him, at each other. Kethrin turning to Palathi, Drethani turning to Tessari, Sethuri turning to the Kethrin they had silently anchored. Species that had spent 9 weeks learning to match each other's footfalls now standing in the aftermath and registering that the matching had not been a drill exercise. It had been a relationship. Relak turned to Veshar, his heavy brow ridge lifted. Veshar's gill crests fluttered once, the one that men acknowledged, not praise, recognition that someone else's effort had mattered to your own. In the left wing, Grevik turned to Tessal. He did not speak. Kethrin did not express gratitude verbally. He shifted his weight forward onto his front foot, the Kethrin gesture of deference to a superior combatant. Tessal's 3 eyes tracked the movement, and her jaw produced a single quiet click, the Sethuri nod. 2 species, 2 body languages, 1 meaning. On the platform, Esrin rose. He stood, 3 eyes fixed on Cade, and raised his right hand, the Sethuri gesture that predated the Lyceum, predated the Coalition, predated interstellar travel. It meant, "I have seen you." Cade met the Commandant's gaze. He did not salute, he nodded, once. Beside Esrin, Davrin's jaw was no longer in the neutral set. It had shifted to the lateral position, the one that meant a Kethrin was reconsidering something previously decided. He did not speak. The formation had answered his recommendation in the only language a military institution could not argue with: performance. Esrin turned, spoke to his staff, and left the platform. The review was over. On the deck, the cadets had begun talking. Low voices, the murmur of organisms processing an experience they did not have words for yet. The Tessari cadet Surik, who had cracked his thoracic plate on day 1, was standing next to a Kethrin twice his size, and the Kethrin had one heavy hand resting on Surik's dorsal plate, careful not to press the min seal. The gesture was un-Kethrin. It was un-Tessari. It was something new. Cade stood at the apex and let it happen. He did not dismiss the formation. He did not debrief. He let the moment live at whatever speed, and in whatever shape 114 individuals from 14 species needed it to live. Kyric, the Tessari who had fought his own neurology for 2 days to trust the deck over the air, was standing in his position with all 6 limbs perfectly still. His compound eyes were not tracking movement, they were fixed, or as close to fixed as compound eyes could get, on the spot where Cade stood. A Tessari holding still was unusual. A Tessari holding still while looking at a single point was, according to the xenobiology department, the closest analog their species had to what humans called reverence. Cade did not know this. He knew only that Kyric was still, and that the stillness meant something the young Tessari had not yet found words for. Beside Kyric, a Drethani cadet Several, the one who had learned to listen with the vibration-sensing structures at the base of his ear frills instead of the air-sensing membranes, had his frills extended fully and angled toward the deck. He was listening to the after-retro, the residual vibration of the formation's last halt, still decaying in the stone. Drethani could hear frequencies that most species could not detect, and the after-retro was carrying information. The composite acoustic signature of 114 organisms who had, for 8 counts, been won. After a while, the cadets began to leave the deck in small groups, not by species, by proximity. Whoever was standing next to them when the moment ended became the person they walked with. It was the simplest thing Cade had ever seen, and it was the most difficult thing the Lyceum had ever produced. Cade watched them go. Each group was its own small formation, not marching, not in cadence, but moving together with a coherence that had nothing to do with drill and everything to do with the 9 weeks that preceded it. A Kethrin and a Tessari, walking side by side, the Kethrin's heavy tread and the Tessari's clicking plates producing a paired rhythm that neither of them was conscious of. 2 Drethani and a Pelathi, the Drethani's ear frills angled toward the Pelathi, listening to a conversation in a register too low for most species to hear. 3 Sethuri, smooth and silent, flanked by a group of Kethrin who were Cade saw it and filed it, moderating their stride to match the Sethuri's pace. The matching was unconscious now. It had moved from the drill into the walk, from the deck into the corridor, from the formation into the organism. That was the thing nobody in the Lyceum's chain of command had understood about formation drill. It was not about the parade deck. The parade deck was a laboratory. The formation was an experiment. The hypothesis was simple. If you teach 14 species to hear each other and choose each other on a counting grid, they will eventually hear each other and choose each other everywhere else. The formation was not the product. The formation was the process. The product was what walked off the deck. The deck emptied. Cade was alone. The cadence pulse was off. The composite stone under his boots was cooling as the station's thermal cycle shifted toward evening. He could feel the residual vibrations of the formation fading, almost gone, like the ring of a bell winding down. He stood there until the ring stopped. Then he walked to the observation wall and looked out at Sethkal Prime turning slowly in the dark. He thought about the exchange program that had brought him here, and the report that had started it, a single organism with 64 legs. He thought about week 1, when he could not even talk to 14 species without causing a collision. He thought about Veshar's cracked voice saying it hurts, and the press she had found 2 days later that turned pain into pulse. He thought about Kyrick fighting his own neurology to trust the deck over the air. He thought about Relak watching what he could not hear. He thought about Vega, about the thing she had said about ears, about the horse ranch in Montana where she was probably, right now, listening to the rhythm of hoofbeats on packed dirt, and hearing the same thing she had heard on parade grounds for 30 years, the presence or absence of a formation in the sound. About the field at Bennying where the sound had traveled across the base and settled into his bones and told him, at 29 years old, what he was going to spend his life doing. He thought about the 11 years between then and now. 4 continents, 14 countries, jungles where the parade deck was mud and the cadence was rain, deserts where the deck was sand and the formation's footprints vanished behind them like they had never been. Mountains where the altitude thinned the voice and the drill had to live in the gesture. Instead, Cade learning to lead by posture when the air would not carry sound. The cadets learning to follow by watching instead of hearing, which was the same lesson Relak had learned on this deck 2 days ago, without knowing that a human sergeant had learned it first in the Andes at 8,000 meters. He was good at it here, where the species were 14, and the anatomy was a chaos of limbs and plates and gills and triple jaws. Where the challenge was the same as it had always been. Convince a group of individuals that the thing they can build together is more precise, more durable, and more dangerous than anything they can build alone. And do not convince them with words. Convince them with the sound of their own footfalls locking in. Cade Morrow stood on the empty parade deck, 41 years old, 11 years into a career that had taken him from red Georgia clay to a space station orbiting a green world he could not pronounce, and he listened to the silence the formation had left behind. It sounded right. He folded his arms, set his jaw, and began planning tomorrow's sequence. The review was over. The work was not. It was never over. That was the other thing Vega had taught him. A formation is not a destination. It is a practice. You run it every day, and every day it tells you something you did not know yesterday, and the day you think it is finished is the day you lose it. Tomorrow he would add a 9th count, then a 10th. Then he would start layering complexity countermarches, split pivots, sequences that required the formation to not just listen but anticipate. And someday, when the cadets could run a 32-count variable tempo sequence across a combat-stressed environment and hold their shape, Cade would stand at the apex and hear the sound that Vega had described to him 12 years ago on a Georgia parade field. The sound of a single organism with 114 legs. He was not there yet. But the ears that heard it lock this morning were the same ears that would hear it lock tomorrow and the day after that, and every day until the posting ended or the cadets graduated or the Lyceum decided a human drill instructor was not worth the exchange program's cost. None of those outcomes mattered as much as the sound. Cade uncrossed his arms, turned from the viewport, and walked off the deck with the same stride he had walked onto it, steady, unhurried, the pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and how many counts it would take to get there.